My name is Sam Keller. I'm 46 years old, and for the last 20 years, I've worked as a land surveyor for a civil engineering firm based out of Columbus. Before that, I did 4 years in the Army, 10th Mountain Division. I know my way around a map and compass. I know how to read terrain, and I'm comfortable in the woods. More than comfortable. I used to love it. It was the only place my mind ever really got quiet. That's all gone now. I'm telling this story because my brother Jake can't. He's not dead, not in the way you bury someone, but the man he was is gone. What's left is just a ghost, and I know what made him that way. I was there for the beginning of it, and I saw the end. Jake is my younger brother by 3 years. Where I was quiet and methodical, he was loud and full of life. He was a born salesman, ran a small but successful dealership selling agricultural equipment. He could talk a farmer into buying a combine in the middle of a drought.
But his real passion, his church, was the deep woods. Every autumn, for the first 2 weeks of bow season, he'd pack up his truck and drive to a small, secluded cabin our grandfather built in the sprawling, hilly woodlands of southern Ohio, near the edge of the Wayne National Forest. It was his ritual, his escape. I didn't always go with him. My work gets busy in the fall, and frankly, I never had the patience for bow hunting. I prefer a rifle, a clean and efficient process. Jake loved the challenge, the silence, the proximity. He loved being part of the woods, not just a visitor. But that year, 5 years ago, he pestered me into going. My wife had been encouraging me to take a vacation, and Jake, having just gone through a messy divorce, said he didn't want to be alone out there. He made jokes about needing a chaperone to keep him from drinking all his whiskey the first night. I agreed. I figured I could scout some terrain, do some hiking, and just enjoy the quiet while he sat in a tree stand from dawn till dusk. The cabin was exactly as I remembered it. Rustic is a generous word. It was one large room, built from timber cleared from the property by our grandfather and his brothers. It had a small kitchenette with a propane stove, a pot-belly stove for heat, and 2 sets of bunk beds. No electricity, no running water. An outhouse stood about 50 yards back in the trees. The place was solid, though. It was built to keep the weather and the wildlife out. We'd been coming here since we were kids. It was as familiar and safe as our own childhood home. We arrived on a Thursday afternoon, planning to stay for a full week. The air was crisp, the leaves were a riot of red and gold, and the sky was a sharp, cloudless blue. It was perfect. We spent the first couple of hours just settling in. We unpacked the coolers, stacked firewood on the porch, and aired the place out.
It smelled of canvas, old wood smoke, and dust. Jake was in his element, bustling around, checking his gear, and telling me about the massive buck he'd seen on his trail cam a few weeks prior. He was electric with anticipation. We grilled steaks over an open fire as the sun went down, drank a couple of beers, and listened to the woods come alive with the evening sounds of crickets and distant owls. It was peaceful. It was normal. Looking back, I try to hold on to that feeling of absolute, uncomplicated peace, because it was the last time I think I ever truly felt it. The first day was uneventful. Jake was up and out before sunrise, camouflaged from head to toe, smelling faintly of the doe urine he used as a lure. I slept in, then made coffee and sat on the porch, reading a paperback. The woods were quiet, but a normal kind of quiet. The rustle of squirrels, the chatter of a blue jay, the gentle sigh of the wind through the oak and hickory trees.
I took a long hike in the afternoon, following a creek bed, and saw plenty of deer sign. Everything was as it should be. Jake came back in the evening, empty-handed but optimistic. He'd seen a few does but was holding out for the big one. We ate, talked, and turned in early. The second day, Friday, was when things started to feel off. It began with the silence. When I woke up that morning, just as the sky was starting to pale, I noticed it immediately. There were no birds, no squirrels, just a dead, heavy quiet that seemed to press in on the cabin. It was the kind of silence that comes after a predator has moved through an area, when every living thing is holding its breath, trying to be invisible. I'm not an overly anxious person, but it was unsettling. I stepped out onto the porch with my coffee. The air was still and cold. Nothing moved. It was like looking at a photograph of a forest. Jake, already in his gear, noticed it too.
He stood by the edge of the clearing, scanning the tree line, his bow held loosely in one hand. "Hear that?" he whispered, not turning around. "Nothing," I replied. "Exactly," he said. "Coyotes must have run something through here last night." That was his explanation. It was a good one, a logical one. A pack of coyotes or even a lone black bear would put the local wildlife on high alert. We accepted it and moved on. Jake headed out to his stand, and I decided to stay close to the cabin, the oppressive silence making me feel strangely exposed. Around noon, I was chopping some kindling when I heard a sound that made me freeze. It was a loud crack, like a massive tree branch snapping under an immense weight. It came from the north, maybe a few hundred yards away, deeper in the woods. It wasn't the sound of a falling dead limb. It was sharper, more violent. It was the sound of green wood being broken. I've spent thousands of hours in the woods. I know the sounds.
A deer moving through brush sounds like a person walking carefully. A bear sounds like a person crashing through carelessly. This was different. This sounded like something huge and powerful just breaking things for the sake of breaking them. I tried to rationalize it. A falling tree, maybe. An old oak finally giving up. But the sound was too singular, too deliberate. I grabbed my sidearm, a Glock 19 I always carry in the backcountry, and made sure a round was chambered. I didn't do it out of any real sense of danger yet, more out of ingrained habit. Caution. I spent the rest of the afternoon feeling watched, the silence of the woods no longer peaceful, but predatory. Jake returned after dusk, looking troubled. He hadn't seen a single animal all day. Not a deer, not a squirrel, not even a chipmunk.
The forest was empty. "It's like a ghost town out there, Sam," he said, shucking off his pack. "I've never seen it like this." He told me he'd found something on his way back, not far from where I'd heard the branch snap. He wanted to show me in the morning. He was being cagey about it, which wasn't like him. His usual post-hunt excitement was replaced by a quiet anxiety that mirrored my own. That night, the temperature dropped, and a cold wind began to blow, rattling the cabin's single-pane windows. We had a fire roaring in the stove, but the warmth didn't seem to reach the corners of the room. The wind moaned through the trees, and with every gust, I felt a fresh wave of unease. We tried to play cards, but neither of us could focus. Every creak of the old cabin, every scrape of a branch against the roof, made us both look up from our hands. Sometime after midnight, I was woken from a light sleep by a sound. It was a low, rhythmic thumping coming from outside. Thump, thump, thump. It was heavy and slow. My first thought was that Jake was up and outside for some reason, but I could hear his steady breathing from the bunk below me. My heart started hammering against my ribs. I lay there, frozen, just listening. The thumping continued for about a minute, seeming to circle the cabin before it just stopped. I held my breath, straining my ears, but there was only the sound of the wind. I told myself it was a branch, a weird echo, anything but what it sounded like. Someone or something heavy walking deliberately around our isolated little fortress in the middle of the night. The next morning, Saturday, the oppressive feeling was still there. We spoke in low voices, as if afraid of being overheard. After a quick breakfast, Jake grabbed his heavy flashlight, even though the sun was up, and told me to bring my pistol. "You'll want to see this," he said, his voice grim. We walked north from the cabin, into the thickest part of the woods. The ground was a soft carpet of damp leaves, and our footsteps were loud in the unnatural quiet. After about a 10-minute walk, Jake stopped. "There," he said, pointing. I looked where he was pointing and saw it. It was a deer, or what was left of one. It was a doe, and it had been torn to pieces. I'm not talking about a clean kill from a predator. This was different. This was violent, savage destruction. One leg was ripped from its socket and lay several feet away. The chest cavity was torn open with brutal force. The ribs snapped like twigs. But the most disturbing part was the head. It was gone. Not chewed off, not carried away. It looked like it had been twisted clean off the spinal column. "No bear did this," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I've seen bear kills. They're messy, but there's a purpose to them. They eat. This was rage." "Coyotes?" I offered, knowing it was a weak suggestion. Jake shook his head. "No tracks. Look." He was right. The leaf litter around the carcass was disturbed, but there were no clear paw prints, no sign of a pack of animals dragging and pulling. There were just a few deep, ambiguous depressions in the soft earth that told us nothing, except that whatever made them was heavy. And then Jake shone his flashlight up into the branches of a nearby oak tree. "That's not even the worst part," he said. Wedged in a fork about 20 feet up was the deer's head. It was just sitting there, placed carefully, its dead eyes staring down at its own mutilated body. It was a display, a trophy, a warning. My blood ran cold. This wasn't the work of an animal. Animals don't create ritualistic tableaus. My mind scrambled for a rational explanation. A person, a very sick, very strong person, was out here in the woods with us. And that thought was, at the time, the most terrifying thing I could imagine. "We should pack up and leave," I said, my voice tight. "Right now." Jake, for once, didn't argue. The bravado he always carried like a shield was gone, replaced by a primal fear I could see in his wide eyes. The woods were no longer his sanctuary. They had become a trap. We turned and walked back to the cabin, constantly looking over our shoulders. The image of that deer's head in the tree burned into my mind. Every shadow seemed to hold a menacing shape. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. We didn't run, but our pace was quick and purposeful. We agreed we wouldn't even pack everything, just the essentials: wallets, keys, phones, and our weapons. We'd get in the truck and go, and we could come back for the rest of the gear with the sheriff in tow. The thought of involving the authorities was a comfort, a link back to the normal world where things made sense. Back at the cabin, the feeling of being watched was so intense it was almost a physical pressure. I felt it on the back of my neck, a cold prickling that wouldn't go away. We worked in silence, throwing our things into bags. I grabbed my hunting rifle, a bolt-action .30-06, from its case and loaded the magazine. Jake did the same with his shotgun, a 12-gauge pump he kept for home defense. We were both armed, both trained, but I felt as vulnerable as a child. The cabin, which had always felt so solid and safe, now felt like a flimsy wooden box. The window seemed too large, the door too thin. As I was zipping up my duffel bag, I heard a sound from the porch. A soft, wet, sniffing sound right at the door. Sniff, sniff. It was loud and close.
The sound of a large animal, its nostrils working, trying to parse the scents inside. Jake froze, his eyes locked on mine. We stood there, motionless, for what felt like an eternity. The sniffing continued, moving from the door to the window next to it. Then came a scrape, the sound of a claw or a fingernail dragging slowly down the glass. My heart was a drum in my ears.
I slowly, carefully, raised my rifle, pointing it towards the door. Jake mirrored me, his shotgun aimed at the window. The scraping stopped. There was a moment of absolute silence, and then a heavy, guttural sound rumbled from just outside. It was a growl, but not like any I had ever heard. It was too deep, too resonant. It wasn't the growl of a bear or a dog. It had a quality to it that felt almost articulate, like it was on the verge of becoming a word. The sound vibrated through the floorboards, a physical presence. Then, a massive impact shook the entire cabin. Something had thrown itself against the wall next to the door. A heavy, solid blow that made the canned goods on the shelves rattle. Jake flinched. "What the hell is that?" he breathed. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat was clamped tight with fear. Another impact, this time on the door itself. The thick oak shuddered in its frame. This was not an animal scratching to get in. This was a deliberate, intelligent attempt to breach our defense. It was testing us. I crept towards the nearest window, the one on the wall opposite the door, and peered through a gap in the dusty curtains. My view was of the clearing and Jake's truck parked about 30 yards away. The sun was getting lower in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the ground. I saw nothing at first. Then, a flicker of movement at the edge of the tree line. Something dark and tall shifted between two trees. It was obscured by foliage and shadow, but it was big, impossibly big, and it was standing on two legs. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. It had to be a man in a dark coat. It had to be. But it was too tall, its proportions all wrong. The shoulders were too broad, the arms too long. As I watched, it took a step out from behind the tree, still partially obscured. I could see a head, but it wasn't human. It was long, with a pointed snout. Canine. Like the head of a wolf or a massive dog, sitting atop a powerful, man-like torso. Before I could fully comprehend the monstrous silhouette, it melted back into the shadows. At the same moment, the attack on the door intensified. A furious scratching and clawing began, the sound of thick claws gouging deep furrows into the wood. Then came a new sound, a high-pitched, almost human scream of rage from right outside. It was a sound of pure, predatory fury, and it sent a spike of ice-cold adrenaline through my veins. "Sam, the window!" Jake yelled. I whipped my head around to see him staring at the window next to the door. A shape was rising up outside it, a dark, massive head blocking out the fading light. For a split second I saw it clearly. A long, dog-like muzzle, pointed ears laid back against its skull, and eyes. They were eyes that glowed with a faint, internal yellow light, like embers in a fire. They were filled with a terrifying, undeniable intelligence. It looked at us, and I knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that it hated us. It saw us not just as prey, but as an intrusion. Jake didn't hesitate. He brought the shotgun to his shoulder and fired. The roar inside the small cabin was deafening, and the window exploded outward in a shower of glass. The creature recoiled with a guttural roar of pain and fury, disappearing from the frame. We were plunged into a ringing silence, broken only by the tinkle of falling glass and our own ragged breathing. "Did you get it?" I shouted over the ringing in my ears. "I don't know," Jake yelled back, already working the pump on his shotgun, chambering a new shell. We waited, listening. The woods were silent again. No crashing retreat, no dying groan. Nothing. It was just gone. But we knew it wasn't. It was out there, in the gathering dark. And now it was wounded. And it was angry. The hole where the window had been was a gaping black mouth. "Block it! Block it now!" I yelled. We dragged one of the heavy wooden bunk bed frames across the floor and slammed it against the wall, covering the broken window. It was a flimsy barricade, but it was better than nothing. We did the same with the other window, shoving the small dining table against it. We were barricading ourselves in, turning our shelter into a tomb. Night fell completely. The darkness outside was absolute. We couldn't risk lighting the lanterns, not wanting to make ourselves better targets. We sat in the pitch black, our backs against the far wall, our guns pointed at the door. The only light was the faint red glow from the vents on the potbelly stove. Every gust of wind, every skittering mouse in the walls, sent a fresh jolt of terror through me. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. We were two modern men, armed and supposedly at the top of the food chain, reduced to huddling in the dark, besieged by something that shouldn't exist. Hours passed. The silence stretched our nerves to the breaking point. Then it started again. A soft scrape on the roof. I tilted my head up, listening. It sounded like something was crawling up there. Heavy but careful. Scrape. Drag. Scrape. Drag. It was moving towards the chimney. A wave of nausea washed over me as I imagined that thing, with its two long arms and powerful legs, climbing onto our roof. Then came a new sound, from the chimney itself. A low, frustrated snuffling, and the clatter of a few small stones or bits of creosote falling into the stove. It was trying to get in through the chimney. The sheer, cunning intelligence of it was horrifying. Jake must have realized it at the same time I did. He scrambled over to the stove, grabbed the poker, and threw open the iron door. He began frantically stoking the embers, throwing in piece after piece of dry kindling. The fire roared back to life, and a plume of thick, acrid smoke billowed up the flue.
A furious, choked snarl erupted from the roof, followed by a loud thud as the creature scrambled away from the smoke. It was followed by a crash as it leaped from the roof back to the ground. We had driven it back, but we both knew it was just a temporary victory. This thing was smart. It was testing our defenses, looking for a weak point. And it was patient. It began to circle the cabin again, but this time it was vocalizing. It made a series of low, guttural clicks and whistles, sounds that were disturbingly complex. It sounded like a form of communication. My blood froze when I heard an answering series of clicks from further out in the woods. There wasn't just one. There were more. My hope, already a flickering candle flame, was nearly extinguished. We weren't fighting a lone monster. We had stumbled into the territory of a pack. The rest of the night was a blur of terror. They didn't mount another direct assault. They played with us. They would throw rocks and pieces of wood against the walls and roof, sudden, sharp impacts in the dark designed to startle us. They would let out blood-curdling howls that seemed to come from all directions at once, a terrifying chorus that was part wolf, part human scream. At one point, I heard a sound that I will never, ever forget. It was the sound of a woman crying for help, coming from just outside the barricaded window. "Please, help me! He's got me! Oh God, please!" It was a perfect mimicry of a human voice, filled with pain and terror. Jake started to get up, his face a mask of confusion and horror. "There's someone out there," he stammered.
I grabbed his arm, my nails digging into his flesh. "Jake, no! It's a trick. Listen." We fell silent, and the crying continued. But there was something wrong with it. It was too perfect, too theatrical. And underneath it, I could hear that low, guttural clicking sound. It was trying to lure us out.
The realization of that predatory intelligence, that cruel cunning, was more terrifying than any physical violence. We stayed like that until the first hint of gray light began to filter through the cracks in our barricades. As the sky lightened, the sounds from outside began to fade. The howls stopped. The rock throwing ceased. By the time the sun was fully up, the woods were silent again. But this time, it wasn't an empty silence. It was a waiting silence. "We have to go," I said, my voice hoarse. "Now, as soon as there's enough light to see." Jake nodded, his face pale and drawn. He looked 10 years older than he had the day before. We devised a simple, desperate plan. We would make a run for the truck. We wouldn't take anything but our weapons. We would go together, back to back, and we wouldn't stop for anything. We waited until the sun was fully above the horizon, flooding the clearing with bright morning light. We took a deep breath, counted to 3, and then I kicked the door open and we burst out into the clearing. The morning air was cold and sharp. The world looked normal. The trees were just trees. The sky was just the sky. But the clearing was not empty. Standing between us and the truck was one of them. It was in the process of systematically destroying Jake's vehicle. It had already ripped one of the doors clean off its hinges and was now standing on the hood, its immense weight buckling the metal, its claws tearing at the windshield. It was enormous. It had to be at least 7, maybe 8 feet tall, with a lean, powerfully muscled build that was a horrifying mix of canine and primate. Its fur was a dark, matted brown, and its legs were bent backwards like a dog's, but it stood upright with an unnerving ease. Its arms were too long for its body, ending in large, almost human-like hands with thick, black claws. And its head. It was the head of a monstrous wolf, with a powerful jaw filled with yellowed fangs. When we burst out of the cabin, it turned its head to look at us, its yellow eyes burning with malevolent intelligence, even in the bright daylight, locked onto ours. It let out a low growl, a sound that was pure, condensed hatred. It wasn't surprised. It had been waiting for us. It had been daring us to come out. For a moment, we were all frozen, man and monster, staring at each other across 30 yards of open ground. Then, it leaped from the hood of the truck, landing silently on the ground, and started towards us. It didn't run. It walked, a slow, predatory swagger, as if it knew we had nowhere to go. That was its mistake. The arrogance of the apex predator. Jake and I had trained for years to react to threats. Our fear was instantly replaced by a cold, focused rush of adrenaline. We raised our weapons at the same time. "Aim for the chest," I yelled, and we opened fire.
The sound of my .30-06 and Jake's 12-gauge slug firing in unison was a deafening roar. My shot hit it square in the torso, staggering it. Jake's slug tore a chunk from its shoulder. The thing roared, a sound of shock and pain, and for the first time, its intelligent eyes showed a flicker of something other than hate. Surprise. It had not expected us to fight back so effectively. It charged. It moved with an unnatural, terrifying speed, covering the ground in great, loping strides. We both fired again. I saw my bullet strike its leg, and it stumbled, but it didn't stop. Jake's shot went wide. It was almost on us. I worked the bolt of my rifle, ejecting the spent casing, chambering a new round. It was too close. I wasn't going to have time for another shot. Suddenly it veered to the side, not at me, but at Jake. It swiped at him with one of its long arms, the black claws extended. Jake tried to jump back, but he wasn't fast enough.
The claws raked across his chest and arm, tearing through his jacket and shirt like they were made of paper. He screamed and went down, his shotgun flying from his grasp. The creature loomed over him, its jaws open, ready to deliver the killing bite. I didn't think. I just reacted. I dropped my rifle and drew my Glock from its holster, firing 3 shots in quick succession into the creature's side and back. The 9mm rounds were like bee stings compared to the rifle, but the surprise and pain were enough. It roared and spun around to face me, its attention now completely on me. Its face was contorted in a mask of fury. Deep, bleeding wounds peppered its torso and shoulder, but it seemed to barely notice them. That was the opening Jake needed. He scrambled away, grabbing his shotgun. As the creature took a step towards me, Jake, on one knee, leveled the shotgun and fired from the hip. The slug hit the creature in the knee joint of its back-bent leg.
There was a wet, cracking sound, and the leg buckled under its weight. It howled, a piercing shriek of agony this time, and collapsed onto its side, thrashing in the dirt. "Go, get to the truck," I screamed at Jake, pulling him to his feet. He was bleeding badly from his arm and chest, but he was moving. We didn't wait to see if the creature would get up. We ran. We scrambled into the ruined truck, me in the driver's seat, Jake collapsing into the passenger side. I fumbled for the keys, my hands shaking so violently I could barely fit the key into the ignition. Behind us, the creature was still howling, a sound of pure agony and rage. The engine turned over. I slammed the truck into drive and stomped on the gas. The tires spun in the dirt, and then they caught. We shot forward, away from the cabin, away from the wounded monster writhing on the ground. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I couldn't. I just drove, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, my foot pressed to the floor. We bounced and skidded down the rough dirt track, branches scraping against the sides of the truck. I didn't slow down until we hit the paved county road, and I didn't stop until we were on the interstate, surrounded by the comforting, mundane sight of other cars and trucks. The real world. We drove straight to the emergency room in the first decent-sized town we came to. Jake was in shock, his breathing shallow. The doctors who treated him were horrified by his wounds. They looked like they'd been made by a bear, they said. 4 deep, parallel gashes running from his shoulder down to his ribs. We let them believe it. What else could we say? We told them we were surprised by a black bear while packing up our campsite. We had to abandon our gear and our truck. It was a flimsy story, but it was believable. It was sane. The local sheriff's department took our statement. They were friendly, professional, and deeply skeptical. An experienced hunter, like my brother, getting mauled by a bear he never even saw. A bear that also somehow managed to rip a door off a Ford F-250. They promised to send a deputy up to the cabin to check it out in a day or 2. We gave them the location. We knew what they would find. Nothing. A ransacked cabin, a damaged truck. They would blame it on vandals and a bear, and that's exactly what happened. The official report cited significant bear activity and probable vandalism. Case closed. We abandoned the truck. Jake never wanted to see it again. I rented a car and drove us home. The drive was silent. We were both locked in our own private hell, replaying the events over and over. The silence, the deer head, the glowing eyes in the window, the final desperate fight in the clearing. We had survived. We had won. That's what I told myself. But I was wrong. The fight wasn't over. For Jake, the worst was just beginning. He went home to his quiet suburban house in a subdivision just outside of town. He had a nice yard, a 2-car garage, a friendly golden retriever named Gus. It was the epitome of safety and normalcy.
For the first week, things were quiet. Jake was on medical leave from work, his arm in a sling, his chest heavily bandaged. He was jumpy and quiet, but I chalked it up to trauma. He wouldn't talk about what happened. He just wanted to forget. Then the phone call started. It began small. He called me late one night, whispering that Gus was going crazy, barking at the back fence that bordered a small patch of woods behind his property. "Probably just a raccoon, Jake," I told him, trying to be the calm, rational one. But his voice was tight with a fear that I knew had nothing to do with raccoons. A few nights later, he called again. He'd woken up to a scratching sound at his back door. Not the light scratching of a branch, but a heavy, deliberate scraping, just like we'd heard at the cabin.
He'd turned on the floodlights, but there was nothing there. The next morning, he found deep gouges in the wood of the door, just like the ones on the cabin door. He sent me a picture. My stomach turned to ice. They were identical. I tried to find a logical explanation. A prankster? Someone who had followed us from the woods? A stray dog? But I knew. Deep down, I knew. It didn't make any sense, but the fear was real. The evidence was real. I told him to call the police. He laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "And tell them what, Sam? That a monster from a nightmare followed me home from a hunting trip? They'll lock me up." He was right. His paranoia grew. He started keeping all the blinds closed, day and night. He bought new locks for all his doors and windows. He slept with his shotgun next to his bed. Gus, his normally friendly dog, became a nervous wreck, whining constantly and refusing to go into the backyard after dark.
Jake said he could feel it watching the house, just like we'd felt it watching the cabin. He said he sometimes saw a movement in the woods behind his house, a tall, dark shape that would disappear whenever he tried to get a clear look. I started driving over to his place every evening after work. I would sit with him, trying to talk about anything else, sports, work, the weather. But the fear was a living thing in that house. It sat between us on the couch. We would both fall silent at every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside. I started bringing my pistol with me. I felt foolish, carrying a gun into a suburban neighborhood, but I did it anyway. The final night came about a month after the incident at the cabin. I was at his house. We were watching TV, the volume turned up loud to drown out the sounds of the night. Gus was sleeping at Jake's feet, but he suddenly shot up, a low growl rumbling in his chest, his eyes fixed on the sliding glass door that led to the backyard patio. The blinds were closed, but the dog was staring at them as if he could see right through them. "It's here," Jake whispered, his face ashen. The dog's growl turned into a frantic, terrified barking. Then we heard it. A low, guttural click from just outside the glass door. The same sound we had heard in the woods, the sound of communication. My blood went cold. I grabbed my pistol from my jacket pocket. Jake fumbled for his shotgun. "Stay here," I said, my voice barely working. I moved slowly towards the blinds, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I reached the cord, took a deep breath, and yanked it. The blinds snapped open, and there it was. Standing on his patio, not 10 feet away, illuminated by the soft glow of the television. It was the same creature. It was massive, its dark form filling the frame of the door. It was just standing there, looking in at us. Its yellow eyes glowed with that same malevolent, hateful intelligence. It had found him. It had followed him for over 100 miles. It had hunted him down. I don't know how long we stood there, locked in that tableau of mutual disbelief and hatred. It felt like an eternity. It didn't try to break the glass. It didn't move. It just watched us, its head cocked slightly, as if it was savoring our terror. Then it did something that shattered the last remnants of my sanity. It raised one of its long, clawed hands and placed it flat against the glass, right at eye level. It wasn't an aggressive gesture. It was a gesture of acknowledgement. I see you. I know you're in there, and I can get to you whenever I want. Then, as silently as it appeared, it turned and melted back into the darkness of the yard. We were left staring at the empty patio. The only evidence it had been there, a large, greasy handprint on the glass. Gus was cowering under the coffee table, whining. Jake just stood there, his shotgun held loosely at his side, his face completely blank. The life had gone out of his eyes. In that moment, the thing on the patio had broken him. It had won. That was the end. The next day, Jake put his house on the market. He sold it for a loss to the first person who made an offer. He sold his truck, his guns, all of his hunting gear. He quit his job. He moved into a small apartment in the middle of the city on the 10th floor. He never set foot in the woods again. He rarely leaves his apartment now. He drinks. He doesn't answer my calls most of the time. The man I knew, my loud, laughing, full-of-life brother, is gone. That thing killed him without ever laying another claw on him. I live with it every day, the memory of it, the knowledge of it. I see those yellow eyes every time I close mine. I left my job as a surveyor. I couldn't be in the woods anymore. My world, which was once so large and open, has become small and walled in. I am haunted by the knowledge that the maps we draw are incomplete. There are things living in the blank spaces, things that have been here long before us, and they are watching us from the shadows. They are strong, they are smart, and they hate us. So I'm telling this story for what it's worth. Not because I expect you to believe me. I wouldn't believe me either. I'm telling it as a warning. The world is not what you think it is. There are dark corners and deep woods where ancient things still hold sway. So if you ever find yourself in the wilderness and the woods go silent, don't try to explain it away. Don't be rational. Just leave. Get in your car and drive away, and don't ever go back. Because some things, once they see you, will never stop hunting. And sometimes, they will even follow you home.